Well, God damn it, you accursed. Welcome to the pod. We're continuing with our summer run of guest cursors, and this week it's Howard Anglin joining Scott and I on the show. We're lucky to have him here. Right now, Howard is a postgraduate researcher at Oxford University. Where'd you go to school, Scott?
School of Hard Knocks. Church of the Poison Mind, David.
Before that, he was Principal Secretary to Premier Jason Kenney and Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper. He's also been a lawyer in New York, London, and Washington, D.C. He's currently on Vancouver Island at a very early time in the morning. So thank you, Howard Anglin. This week on the pod, we're going to talk some G7. What signal did the G7 send this week? How did Trudeau do? And how do you handle foreign policy trips like this when there's so many issues to contend with at home? Speaking of issues at home, we have the Nova Scotia inquiry and allegations of possible political interference. Do we have another scandal here, and what's the cumulative effect of scandal upon scandal? Chrystia Freeland let us know on the weekend that it's okay if we're all mad at her. What? Oh. And then our cursed clipping. Is Michelle Rempel-Garner substacking her feelings about the state of the Conservative Party and its leadership? We'll dive into that topic. And finally, Gordon Pinsent will ring us out with our Hey Yous for the week. Howard, great to have you here on The Curse of Politics. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. A long-time listener, first-time caller here. Really, it's an honor to be here in the Spinal Tap Drummer of the Week seat.
Hey, man, I'm just glad we could get through your credentials before we ran out of time. That's some kind of freaking resume. And another mantle.
I'm just going to shut up and let my credentials speak for the rest of the year. Okay.
Another mantle. Welcome to our podcast, Morningwood, where we talk about our bodies and politics.
Yeah. Howard, when I was on the National, just before the Insiders segment would start, Peter Mansbridge would say to the three panelists, he would say, energy. That's what he would say. Energy. So I'm going to say that to you. I never say it to Reid.
No.
Because I'm not trying to torque that thing any higher.
Speaking of Morningwood.
Yeah, well, I've got a very full cup, a very full cup of very strong coffee that my dad made for me. One of the benefits of being home visiting parents. And so hopefully you'll see my energy levels rise gradually throughout the podcast.
Excellent. And let's get at it. So the shit show that is the Portapique massacre and the fallout in Nova Scotia took a political turn this week. It's alleged that RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki told the officers in Nova Scotia that she had promised either or both of the PMO or Minister Blair that the officers would identify the weapon used by the shooter. Though this weapon or a similar one was contained in federal gun control legislation, and they wanted the boost of it being associated with the massacre. Apparently, this is not standard procedure. None of Lucki, Trudeau, or Blair have issued airtight denials to this point that I have seen. Scott, is this important, or is this a nothing burger, as Jenny would say?
I don't think you can dismiss it as a nothing burger. There may be less to this than meets the eye, but I think it merits the eye, don't you? I mean, when I look at it, the underlying principle is an important one. So I don't want to unfairly bash on people because I do think there's been a lot of hyperbolic piling on this. People just broadly asserting that any contact with the RCMP commissioner is outrageous and it shouldn't happen. The truth of the matter is the RCMP commissioner ought to be communicating with the Minister of Public Safety. It's not untoward that the RCMP commissioner might be consulted on something like gun control and what broad measures, where do the cops think, as one representative of an important police agency, what does she think on that? But the line that cannot be crossed is, look, I want you, if I were in the Prime Minister's office, I'd be having a conversation with the RCMP commissioner saying that next time you're on a phone call with those that are running the operations of this investigation, that you ensure that they release the details of that weapon, because that's going to have a beneficiary effect in terms of the gun control debate. That would be political guidance with respect to an investigation. We don't know that happened. If this was a court of law, those notes wouldn't be admissible, right? They're hearsay. But there are other people that were in that conversation. Was that their recollection? We've had, you say they're not airtight denials, but we've had denials, right? Certainly from the minister and PMO, that they didn't have those discussions, they didn't issue those kinds of instructions. So,
Well, the Prime Minister only said he didn't put undue pressure on.
Right.
Or something to that effect. It didn't deny a conversation about it.
I think it would be very uncomfortable if they canvassed the balance of those that were present And there was one after another corroborating argument that, yes, actually, the commissioner said that she wanted that out because she had made promises with respect to a political agenda. And then I think it would follow the RCMP commissioner would have to say, well, why did you, is that the case? Were you speaking too broadly? Does that reflect the reality? Was anybody instructing you with respect to the investigation? Did they put pressure on you to affect the investigation? Because that's like when I was in the prime, I'd be interested to hear what Howard says. When I was in the prime minister's office, I recall in 3 years talking to the
He says that, but he doesn't mean it, Howard.
No, I wouldn't know because I talked to the RCMP commissioner twice. One was a group of officials on security matters. He was part of Deputy Minister of Defense, Deputy Minister of Public Safety on a broad public policy matter. Whether or not to call them a har inquiry, which we promptly ignored his advice, and thank God, because it turned out that it was, smeared all over Zaccardelli's hands. And the second was when there was a fatal shooting of 4 RCMP officers, and the Prime Minister wanted to know how to get in touch with the families, and that was it. The idea of calling up in the middle of an investigation, like, that's outrageous. That I have trouble believing it would happen because it's so beyond the norm, so clearly a red line. I just have trouble imagining it would occur. Howard?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear that I don't find it hard to believe it happened with this government. Because frankly, it fits a pattern of a lot of these liberal scandals over the last few years. It's the blithe insouciance with which this government seems prepared to manipulate the institutions of government and undermine norms is frankly breathtaking. And I don't say that, I know that'll come across sounding like a partisan hack, but directing the RCMP in the middle of an investigation, I'm glad Joe Scott says that would be unthinkable in his day, it would be unthinkable in my day. If that happened, and we don't know what happened, but there's a pretty hot smoking gun right here. Scott mentioned that these are just notes, just hearsay. Putting my lawyer hat on, contemporaneous records, notes taken at the time of a meeting, are often actually admissible, and they are the gold standard of evidence. And yes, they should probably be backed up by testimony from all the people who were actually there, and I hope we get the firsthand evidence. But those notes sound pretty bad. I mean, they really do. And then, of course, the fact that they were withheld until the last minute just raises the level of suspicion. But to get back to what actually happened here, or is alleged to have happened here, starting with, gosh, I don't know how far you go back, the firing of the clerk of the Privy Council in the first month of government, although they eventually rehired her, the sticking the police on the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, Mark Norman, just upended the Canadian Armed Forces for almost a year there before the CAF did its own job upending itself. SNC level. I mean, this sounds more like that. It's how much. It sounds like a government that doesn't really see a distinction between the institutions of government and the interests of liberal policy, and putting pressure on an independent third party. In SNC Lavalin case, it was the Crown Prosecution Service through the Attorney General. In this case, allegedly, it's the RCMP. And these are foundational institutions of our government, and the fact that they seem quite prepared to prod, poke, cajole, manipulate, perhaps pressure. The phrase undue pressure, no undue pressure is funny because in the course of an ongoing investigation, any pressure is undue pressure. No undue pressure would be actually not saying anything about it. But we'll see. I think it's absolutely worth having hearings. I think it's worth airing. In terms of what's going on behind the scenes, I'm sure there's a lot of scrambling going on in that PMO. And Scott, I'm sure you can relate to what's like when a scandal first breaks. Everybody's trying to scramble to figure out who actually knows what, who actually said what records are there out of who said what to whom. Can the scandal be contained? Is there a scandal in the first place? B, is this something that they can just throw Brenda Lucki under the bus for? Or is it something that penetrates Bill Blair's office? If so, could it be contained there? I'm sure these conversations are happening, and conversations that they didn't expect to be happening in the first week of summer. And I think they're lucky that the committee hearings will be happening in the summer when people generally aren't paying attention. But if there's a bombshell in there, the fact that this is now part of a pattern of undermining institutions, I think will stick to them. As you guys know in government, the things that don't stick in your first couple of years start to stick by year 7, 8, 9. There's a cumulative effect to these scandals, and it doesn't look good for the government from where I'm sitting.
So let me be a skeptic here. just for the sake of to be the devil's advocate. The RCMP, I think we'd all agree, has been a dysfunctional organization for a very, very long time with some very bad culture as part of that. Brenda Lucki was appointed to try to correct that. I believe to my bones that she has faced substantial pushback from the old boys club in the RCMP and that there are people that are out to get her. Is that a mitigating factor in this? And is that somehow, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if this contemporary notes were less than met the eye a little bit.
I think that's sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, I was just going to say, I'll say two things. I'll add to that. I mean, I think one, that's a possibility. I think it's difficult to know whether that's what's going on, but that's not implausible to me. It seems when you take a look at the environment, what's going on. I also am a little more skeptical of the pattern thing. I agree with Howard, because we've lived through it and seen it. The cumulative controversies / scandals, right? I would say more controversies because I'm not sure all these things elevate themselves to full-blown scandals. We love to throw the word scandal around. We love to throw the word corruption
Pearson Airport's
around.
not a scandal. It's a right, whatever. Something.
And I don't think SNC-Lavalin is a different thing than what happened here. And by the way, firing the clerk is not something that you're not allowed to do. That's entirely appropriate. You might decide, I want a new clerk. I wish, we had fired the clerk, David.
It's absolutely appropriate, but it's undermining the public service in a way. It was done without any explanation, and they ended up hiring her back afterwards. It was sloppy. It was clumsy. That to me goes
sloppy,
to the
but
point
it's
of
not a scandal.
Well, that to me goes to the point of just not having. If it's a classic, and I hate to say this, it's classic. If Harper had done it, this is undermining the norms of our government, et cetera, et cetera. I just threw it out there because it's another third-party independent organization that they seem to have no respect for.
It's not a third-party independent organization. It's a public service that they administer. So, I mean, you're allowed to put in place your own top public servant. I just think when we conflate these things, we do a disservice to the seriousness of the actual
This is another reason, Scott, why Paul should not have fucking negotiated that appointment for Himmelfarb with Harper. Because otherwise Harper would have had to fire Himmelfarb, which he surely would have done.
I don't want to get everybody distracted on something happened in the first year of government that's now being rectified.
No. You're not crawling off that tree branch that easily, Howard. Tell us what you had in mind for Himmelfarb. Let's start a little fire, and we can roast our marshmallows on it.
SNC level. But Scott, to finish the thought, though, the question that you actually asked, David, yeah, I think that it's worth considering that dynamic, but it's also worth always keeping separate in your mind one dynamic, which may be a problem, and the facts of a specific case. And I think those notes are part of the facts of a specific case. There were multiple people in that meeting. It should not be hard to actually figure out what happened in that meeting. Although, again, this government seems to do a great job of obfuscating at committees but I think one of the questions they'll have to have is how much faith do they actually have in Brenda Lucki at this point? Do they think the getting rid of Brenda Lucki will actually solve the problem, or will it actually make it worse? Because if she's come to testify after she's already been thrown under the bus, does that open up? Does that make the committee much more unpredictable? Will the flak be flying in all sorts of directions that they can't predict? But these are the conversations I'm sure are happening there. And if it does come out that the government did apply pressure, any pressure, undue pressure, then I think that is serious. And even if it just results in losing an RCMP commissioner and a senior minister, I say just, that would be another serious blow to the government. But we're not there yet.
Blair's a very senior guy, for sure.
Absolutely.
Hurley Burleyites, if you know me personally, or if you've been listening to either of our podcasts for any length of time, you know I love a good story. It's one of the reasons I'm such good friends with Scott Reid, who spins a yarn with the best of them. And we're coming now to the last two parts of a story I've been telling about TELUS's environmental, social, and governance commitments. Yes, TELUS is our presenting sponsor, but the reason I'm happy to tell it is this. It's a story that rises above words to actions. What gets measured gets done is one of TELUS's corporate mantras. They measure, act, and then publicly disclose their performance across all ESG metrics, because measurement and transparency are critical to getting any real work done in this space. It's not just TELUS saying that. It's the basis of a new report by PwC, released just last month, which outlines how Canada can improve its performance across economic, environmental, and social policy objectives to help meet UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot in there, but here's a key part of the story and how the logic unfolds. Our government can play a central role in accelerating the standardization and regulation of ESG reporting. Regulated reporting drives the private sector's adoption of ESG best practices, and that is what leads to more meaningful action, above and beyond so many greenwashed words and empty gestures. I'll wrap up this story next week, Hurly-Burlyites, with why ESG is becoming increasingly important for companies looking to create more value across all stakeholders. But for now, know this. TELUS, a company that's always been driven by social purpose, leads in this space. And you can find evidence of that, transparently reported evidence, in their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. All right, to a topic that's more fun for me. Our clipping of the week, sound effect please. Our clipping of the week is courtesy of Michelle Rempel-Garner's Substack. In announcing that she was not running to be the leader of the United Conservative Party in Alberta, she writes the following. Let me preface what I'm about to say with this. The UCP has done a lot of good work and has put the province on solid footing. Many members of the team have worked really hard and achieved a lot of good things. Same goes for the federal Conservatives. I respect and appreciate the people in both these teams. But in both parties, there have also been squabbles that have erupted in the pages of national media, public meltdowns, nearly missed physical fights, coups, smear jobs, leaked recordings and confidential emails, lack of consensus on critical issues, caucus turfings, people harassed to the point where they resign roles, and hours-long meetings where members have been subjected to hours of public castigation. There have been heated exchange to get basic concerns addressed, unjustified insularity in decision-making, shunnings, exclusionary cliques, and more. This is all a matter of public record, and it is not exaggerated. It's natural for passions to run hot, for egos to swell, and for intrigue to happen in politics. Anyone entering politics needs to be prepared to handle that. But the stuff I listed above that happens in both the provincial and federal parties crosses a line. It should never happen in a functional place of business, political or otherwise. And then she went on to say that neither Scheer nor O'Toole were given a fair chance to be leader by their caucuses. So Howard Anglin, I have to ask you, are the UCP and the Conservative Party of Canada governable working institutions? Or are they so deeply divided over personal and policy issues that they're dysfunctional?
Well, her description of the internal dynamic of the UCP caucus actually didn't make it seem nearly as bad as it is real life. Sounded great.
Quite a rosy picture.
If only it were that. No, I kid. Look, there's truth to that, obviously, in what she's saying. But is it ungovernable? Absolutely not. Because I think we have to remember the law that did happen in the middle of COVID. And everybody, the refrain you always hear now when talking about the UCP is, the problem started before COVID. Sure, there were problems before COVID, but they were minor and manageable, and they were the growing pains of a party that was a marriage of convenience between two groups that had been at each other's throats for a number of years. And I think some of the real damage that COVID did is it didn't give the party a chance to actually come together and gel in the way that a party does, particularly because they couldn't meet in person for a significant period of time. They couldn't have the social events. They couldn't bond on those late night legislative sessions.
Oh, wait, they could bond they could bond in the Sky Palace over a couple of rye, couldn't they?
I was glad I was gone by then. Anyway, it wasn't rye, it was Jameson's.
No, that's right.
A not particularly fancy Irish whiskey, as I heard. But the Breakfast of Champions in the Alberta legislature. Sorry, that's speaking of me. That's not an innuendo about anybody else. But I think that they were denied the opportunity to come together as a party, and I think that opportunity still exists. And of course, it's governable. Every party is actually governable. The CPC is clearly governable. I don't see any rifts that are unusually large in the history of Canadian politics. Look, there were a lot of allegations and innuendo in there. It's not clear what I think Michelle was always referring to. And it's really just obiter dicta to the bottom line, which is that she didn't feel that she was the person to lead the UCP, and I assume the CPC. And in politics, if you don't believe...
First use of Latin on the curse of politics.
Sorry? No,
the first use of Latin on the curse of politics.
Sorry, mea culpa.
Caucus Imperius was the other, I believe.
In politics, if you don't believe you're the person to lead a party, then you're not the person to lead a party. And I think that's the bottom line here. And there was a lot of sort of airing of vague, fairly vague and indeterminate grievances in the letter. But I think that's all beside the point. The real news, I think, from a purely political horse race standpoint that you didn't mention, David, is that she's left the Patrick Brown campaign and is not returning after deciding not to run for the UCP leadership. I think in terms of the race, the major race before us in the country, I think that's the most important fact. And I think it's a pretty damning fact for the Patrick Brown campaign. I don't know why she joined the Patrick Brown campaign in the first place. Michelle's a friend. I believe I was the first person to ever donate to her nomination campaign back in 2009 or whenever that was. She's an important voice within the party. She has a very high profile, and she's very successful with her use of social media and communications. But I don't know why, after sitting out for 2 consecutive leadership races, she decided this was the one to throw her hat in the ring, or her hat behind somebody else, to mangle a metaphor, and that person would be Patrick Brown. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense to me, and I still don't understand that. But I'm glad she's out of that camp, and now I can think the third CPC MP to lead that campaign in the last couple of weeks. And I think that's a great sign for Patrick. I think that's the major news for the federal race.
Scott, didn't she basically say that the party was full of a bunch of assholes?
That's kind of how I heard it. I think that's how a lot of people heard it. And I think, that's going to attract some internal fire, obviously, when you say stuff. And there's more than one, as always, there's probably more than one thing going on. I can't pretend to have the sort of insight that Howard would. There's some ego in there. I'm not going to run. Here's what my rationale is. This is why it's not me, it's you. This is, kind of thing going on there. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, but I don't think that necessarily obviates, her fundamental point, which is, look, the party's becoming a bucking bronco of populist grievance politics, and both those. I mean, it's not true necessarily of all. I mean, it's obviously Tim Houston's got a whole different bag going on in Nova Scotia or whatever have you, even Ford in Ontario, even Legault in terms of his sort of conservative coalition in Quebec. But federally, certainly UCP, and I think it does highlight some of the headaches. I guess the takeaway I have though is, I think, people continue to talk about this stuff. See, this shows you how divided it is. It shows you the struggle that's happening. I think it's a lamentation for what is gone, not what is happening. I think it's a lamentation about, I wish the party was what it was once, but it isn't that thing. It wants to be Pierre Poilievre's party. It wants to be a populist movement. It sees a lot of political potential in that. There is a lot of anger to be harnessed. It sees value and virtue and money to be raised and votes to be corralled. And so it's picking that. And I don't think the debate is, if the debate was what it was, then Patrick Brown would be running more handily in this race. Jean Charest wouldn't be a punchline of a candidate in this race. Poilievre's going to win. This is what the party wants. This direction it's choosing. And I think that it falls to its opponents to confront it and defeat it. And we all know I have a bunch of complaints about how well I think the Liberals are doing on that front, or are set to do. But I don't think that her note tells us that the party is divided. I think the note tells us that she's in a minority that is lamenting the way that the party has gone, the path it has chosen. It's over. It's like her and Tasha Keratin and Jean Charest are lamenting a party that no longer exists.
You guys, I'm just going to say something a little bit self-reflective that maybe opens up this conversation a little bit. leaving aside the UCP, I don't know enough about it, but the CPC, I believe that the Poilievre campaign is running the most brutal get on board or be fucked campaign, Scott, since we ran the leadership in 2003.
Yep.
Right? And
this is how we got attached to the word thugs, right, David?
yeah, exactly. And I've got to believe, that there are implications for the party going forward from the campaign being run this way, and that there are people who are ostensibly on board with it who maybe aren't fully intellectually on board with it, and there may be trouble down the road. I mean, this is a line we learned from John Turner's leadership review: take no prisoners. The Poilievre campaign is a take no prisoners campaign. In my experience, those come with consequences, Howard.
I don't see it. I really don't. Maybe I'm blinded by my partisanship. I don't see it. It looks like a pretty standard campaign to me when it comes to that aspect of it. I think you may be confusing the stridency of the policy that's being staked out with the internal political sort of arm twisting or something that you're suggesting is going along with it. I've seen no evidence of that. I haven't heard anybody say that. I've heard people say things, as you just said, that they don't recognize the party that this has become or is becoming, largely from former PCs from 25 years ago. And I don't think anybody would dispute that the party has evolved since then. Frankly, a lot of them said that when Harper took over in 2003, and a lot of them came back to the fold afterwards. And I see the same thing happening here. I think if Pierre wins, I think he will make every effort to bring those people together because he's smart enough. He's been around long enough. Our friend Jenny's been around long enough to know that the Conservative Party cannot win without winning Atlantic Canadians who have a slightly different tone of politics or brand of politics. They can't win without some Quebecies. They can't win without Ontario, which just went hard for the Ford sort of happy, cheery brand.
But less on the policy side. Less on the policy side, Howard, and more on the does Michelle Rempel feel like there's even before this, after she's written this thing, it's a whole nother kettle of fish. But is part of her reason for writing this thing that she already saw the writing on the wall for her future in the federal party? For not having supported Pierre and having supported Brown.
I think if that were the case, she wouldn't have said, I want to make it very clear that I'm going to reoffer as a candidate in Calgary.
Well, and then immediately leaked to the Toronto Star that she's in the verge of being thrown out of caucus?
I'm not close enough to the internal caucus politics these days in the CPC to know how much of that is personal middle school drama dynamics. And I don't want to minimize if there's any actual serious claims of harassment or bullying or something going on. That's different from normal internal caucus dynamics. But look, parties do change. Occasionally people feel they've changed too far, that they can no longer be part of this. This certainly happened with the Liberal Party after Trudeau took over. All I heard for a couple of years after that was from former Blue Liberals, former Martin and Christian Liberals who felt that they didn't recognize the party that the Liberal Party had become. I think a lot of people said the same thing when Harper took over. Those people largely came back to the fold. Marjorie Le Breton, who came out and said, took a swipe at Pierre this week, back in 2003, said something almost identical about Harper, that if he became leader, it would be a takeover and it would damage the party. I think parties divide during leaderships and they come back together afterwards. And not necessarily everybody comes back together, but the parties by and large come together, sometimes with a slightly different configuration. They move forward. That's how parties evolve. I actually don't see anything out of the ordinary here. And I think the stridency of the policy should not be confused with the kind of backroom manipulation that you seem to be alleging. And I haven't heard a peep of that. I haven't heard anybody other than just the normal concerns that an MP might have of, well, if I back this person, will this person resent it in the future? That's just normal. I haven't heard anything out of the normal here.
Well, I have. I mean, let's be honest. What about Ed Fast? I mean, it isn't just a stridency of policy. I mean, Ed Fast comes out and says something that's in the context of a leadership campaign and in his position as finance critic, and says something that is not in keeping with what Pierre Poilievre has said. Those two things are publicly and immediately contrasted. And next thing you know, caucus removes him as caucus, and the interim leader remove him as finance critic. I think that's I don't think you have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out the math there. If you're one of these caucus members and say, well, which way is the wind blowing, right?
So I was told there'd be no math on the podcast.
So I think of that. And I think, there is you're not a real conservative. Like, I think parties get into a dangerous place when they start doing these purity tests. And, I think, you want to be in the big tent business, not in let's be honest, like, let's go back to before the merger. You weren't really on our side. You're not really you're not pure lane. You're not like that shit gets really, that can be really toxic. Now, maybe you're right. Maybe that's just all because of the emotion of a leadership. And there's no question that this particular campaign, not the first of its kind, but this particular leadership campaign particularly fights with lead weights in its boxing gloves. Maybe it'll all sort of be salved over. I noticed, Poilievre, to be fair, throwing his arm around Peter MacKay. I feel like that looks more like a capitulation than an outreach. But what the heck?
Jenny's on her game, eh? Marjorie Le Breton has barely finished speaking, and they wheel out Elmer.
That's good stuff. And you can't quarrel with the impressiveness of the professional political operation, but I just like the Ed Fast example, the sort of purity test, the online, like, fuck that guy. That guy was never a real liberal stuff. I just think that stuff has got an edge to it that will linger, and I think you can draw at least a dotted, if not a direct line between that and the kind of letter that Michelle Rempel-Garner wrote last week.
All right. Okay. So, Moving on. Trudeau is off at a series of international meetings. He has to go, right? There's no choice about that. These things happen. The G7 meeting happens. The Commonwealth meeting happens. You have to go. But the optics of swanning around beautiful places with important people, seemingly having quite a good time doing it, are not ideal when people back here really feel like they're suffering. How did he navigate those waters so far over this trip, Howard?
I'll actually start with your first comment. I don't think he has to go to G7. I don't think he has to go to the CHOGM, to the Commonwealth Head of Government. I think Harper sent Deepak O'Brien to attend the meeting in Sri Lanka, probably because we were protesting their human rights abuses. And Rwanda, who were trying to come lately to the Commonwealth in 2009, never a former member of the British Empire, atrocious records on everything from gay rights to abortion, the topic of the week. He could have easily, if he'd wanted to skip that, send a parliamentary secretary or somebody to that. But the G7 for sure in Elmau in Germany is something he has to attend, and it's important to attend. We have to remember that Canada is always kind of lucky to be part of the G7. We were the last member to join the G7. We are usually the smallest economy, rivaling Italy in some years. And we have to earn our place there every time. We have to keep reminding people why it's important that Canada's there. And I think for the first day, it was not clear that we had a reason to be there, because the number one issue that people in Europe are talking about, rolling back some of these energy transition measures that were, I think, in retrospect, taken a little too optimistically and a little too quickly. Canada didn't really have anything to say, but finally, towards the end, Trudeau seems to be remembering that he's the PM of an energy superpower and saying that Canada may have a role to play in helping supply the world's energy in the medium term without jeopardizing our long-term transition away from fossil fuels. I think that's a useful concession that will be noticed in Europe and at the G7. I think it's also important for the domestic audience. I think your question was really about the disparity between being off in Europe schmoozing with world leaders and Canadians at home worrying about how they're going to put bread on the table and fill their gas tanks. I think that just goes to the point that with modern communications, you're never away from home. Every message that you have internationally has to resonate at home. You have to think about how it will play at home. And I think finally coming around to talk to maybe addressing the supply side of energy. Maybe Canada can actually start producing more natural gas to help feed the world supply and bring down one of the major cost drivers for the rising cost of living. Not this summer, but in the medium term. I think finally he's got a message that Canadians might listen to and think, okay, fine, he's actually talking about issues that might affect me. If he can make that connection, but the Liberal Party seems allergic to actually making this connection between the rise of the cost of living and the crunch in oil and gas prices. So many of somebody like the former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz coming out last week and saying, look, high oil and gas prices may be permanent now. Well, it's a direct result of policies that have been designed to make oil and gas rare. And it's economics 101. You make something rare, the price is going to go up. So the US is talking about expanding energy supply. Europe's talking about expanding energy supply, rolling back electric vehicle mandates, refiring coal plants. UK, Boris Johnson's talking about mining coal again there. And Canada was sort of sitting on our hands with one of the world's biggest supplies of gas and oil. And I think finally starting to talk about it and then joining the world's conversation. Whether they can link that back to the cost of living here and is a different question, and whether they can navigate the internal politics of the Liberal caucus on that. That's another question.
Scott, I give him 2 positive points on international policy and a demerit point on domestic policy. My 2 positives are, I'll disagree with Howard. I think there was a real reason to go to the Commonwealth, and that is that most of those Commonwealth countries are not supporting Ukraine. And that Johnson and Trudeau really put on a push to get the other members of the Commonwealth to understand what was at stake here. Point number 1, which is worth doing. Point number 2 is, to Howard's point, he seems to have struck a deal with Germany about LNG. German Chancellor is going to come to Canada this summer, and they're going to apparently finalize some agreement about LNG exports, which is a very positive thing for Europe. German ambassador told me on the show that's what they need is our LNG. On the other hand, domestically, he woke up on Saturday morning and announced this cabinet committee to look at effectiveness of government, which just strikes me as the silliest fucking thing I've ever seen.
Yep. So I'm more with you in the sense that I believe a couple things. I don't think it's like, oh, he had no choice to go. I think he should have gone. I think he absolutely should be there. I'm 100% reject the notion he ought not to have been in there, where he could have blown off the Commonwealth, not only just for the specific reasons you mentioned, but for generic reasons. Like, I think that, we ought to be in the world of participating in as many international alliances as possible and as many tables as we can be seated at, whether they're as powerful and small as the G7 or whether they're as large and sometimes frustrating as the Commonwealth. We ought to be there, and La Francophonie and APEC and everything else that we can. And because any mechanism that we have, multilateral tools to move forward our agenda and coordinate, that just seems to me to be in our interest, given that we're not a superpower. My complaint, it gets to more or less the same thing you guys are saying. My complaint is that I don't see the Prime Minister trying hard enough, and let's not take away from the point you make about Germany and LNG. Like, that's a significant policy development if it bears fruit in the way we might hope. But I don't see them trying hard enough in their communications from these international visits. He's going to be on the road internationally for 9 days. We know the cost of living issue is burning with people. And I don't see him doing making a clear enough effort in front of the microphone saying, the shit we're talking about here, right, is animated by my desire to make things more affordable where you are, to stop the problems that are causing the cost of living increases, and to try and put in place some solutions that will make things better. And I just don't, it feels to me more like going through the agenda items and the itinerary and the topics of those international meetings without a muscular effort to connect it to domestic realities. I would not permit any prime minister I was working for, I wouldn't permit them to go out and talk without starting saying, like, this is how this meeting affects the cost of living debate that we are working on. This is how this has helped and for one extra day. This is why this is one good expenditure of my time on this issue and why it should matter to you, and I hope it bears fruit. Like, I don't see that. And then when you compound it with this cabinet committee, we're going to appoint a task force. It's like, fuck? It's like the Science Council of Krypton, right? Jor-El's yelling, the planet's going to explode. And they're like, well, we formed a cabinet committee of the Science Council, and they will meet, 30 trips around the red sun, they shall meet and then report back to us. I mean, come on, it's just, it's
Paul Wells wrote something about this that's really funny, by the way. It's worth reading on his Substack.
Yep.
Is this the Top Gun review or the?
No, this is the review of the parliamentary. It's the review of Trudeau's cabinet committee. It's not. Yeah.
Well, I actually have a question. Is this new task force superseding the task force to deal with the passport offices, or is that being folded into this task force?
Well, that
process.
Is yeah. I think you're imagining two things where there's one. Now there's Cabinet Committee A and Cabinet Committee B. Neither one of them are this. What can you say? I mean, what
was it supposed to do? Like Wells asked this. Asks this question. Wells asks this question. And, Scott, you're on here every week, and I'm joining you, and we're yelling at the government to be sharper politically, to get more focused on the challenge that Pierre Poilievre represents, all this kind of stuff. And so what is the audience that the government thinks is attracted to a Saturday morning announcement from Europe about a cabinet committee? Like, why would you even bother to do that?
Paul's piece, and, Paul and I have had our differences over the years, but his Substack piece, by the way, let's just do a little plug. It's well worth the price of subscription. It's good stuff. Thoughtful, funny, interesting. And he explores the logic of it, right? That's what's so great about that section of his thing, where he sort of says, no, before we just shit all over it, let's imagine, let's literally go through the thought exercise, not as a snark, but genuinely. So are you thinking that people that are dissatisfied by the fact that they're inclined to vote for you, but they want to see more effort from you, do you think they're satisfied by this? Obviously, your critics will find it derisory, but and the answer that he arrives at is that there's no good answer. It's just you call governmentitis, right? It's just that somebody said, well, listen, I mean, one thing we can do immediately is form a task force. A cabinet committee? No, maybe not a cabinet committee, but a task force composed solely of cabinet committee members. That might fucking hit the bullseye. That might just turn Canada around right there. Okay, good. Do it. God almighty.
Howard, how do governments convince themselves that this is sensible shit?
Well, I can't speak for this specific government, but that won't stop me trying. I think this government actually has trouble doing policy. I don't think it likes doing policy. I don't think it's particularly adept at doing policy. I don't think when it actually comes to making hard decisions and following through and getting something through the system, which is difficult, as we all know, being government, seeing it through to the end, once you're 6 months past or even a month past the photo op, I think they lose interest. And I don't think they're good at policy. And so if a problem can't be solved with an announcement, a photo op, or handing out huge chunks of cash, I think they throw their hands up in the air. And this is what the bureaucracy probably comes to them with. And they say, well, it's something. Really, and I think that, to get back to the disconnect perhaps between Trudeau being in Europe and the problems here in Canada, I think without a clear policy to announce, without a good news announcement, they're quite happy to let Chrysler Freeland do the tour of talk shows here, being the bearer of bad news. Because when Trudeau can be Ed McMahon handing out checks, he's happy to bound down the steps of Rideau Cottage and announce the latest handout every day. But when it comes to the really tough slog of talking about deficits and inflation and the M2 money supply, let's send Freeland out to take that, explain to Canadians why they're allowed to hate her. I think they're actually out of ideas. I think it is a tired government. This happens in your second, third term. Your platform's being implemented or discarded. You've exhausted all the ideas that you could have had in the 7 years that you could have implemented, and now you're stuck with what's been sitting on the dusty shelves of the Langevin basement or whatever it's called now. And they bring up task forces and action plans and cabinet committees and process, because that's what government does when it doesn't know what else to do.
So this past week, our sponsor CN devoted a day to celebrating safety. Workplace safety is an industry grail. We've all seen those signs in factories and on industrial sites, tallying accident-free days. But when your job is deploying some of the most powerful machines on Earth to move millions of tons of cargo over thousands of miles every year, Safety becomes a baked-in prime directive. CN is responsible not just for keeping its 20,000-plus railroaders safe, but also all the cities, towns, and villages along its North American network. Anyway, CN's safety celebration honored several employees who've gone the extra mile of ingenuity, so to speak, like the track inspectors in Manitoba, who began carrying cans of spray dye, using it to expose rail defects that might have caused a serious accident had they gone unnoticed. The railway also spotlighted 42 individuals who managed to serve 35 years or more without a single injury. One of them is a fellow named Tim Stanbaugh, who started with CN in Alberta in 1976. He remembered that back then, safety was something you learned about on the fly. You figured it out for yourself. He's still a railroader, and when he collected his award, he said CN's modern training programs and safety standards now set the standard in the industry and are widely copied. After 46 years in railroading, Tim had two signal pieces of wisdom. First, he said, think about what you're doing. Impulse can be deadly. Second, he said, if we keep improving, luck will have no place on the railroad. Luck has no place on the railroad. How's that for an excellent slogan? Congratulations to them all. So, Howard, I'm going to pick up on what you said about allowing Freeland to message on the economy. And I'm just going to say, I think that has to stop. I think that Trudeau's going to have to take this over because she can't do it. I mean, we talked about this extensively last week to the point where, Scott and I felt that maybe we'd been overly harsh on Chrystia Freeland about her speech at the Empire Club. And then she went on the Rosie Barton show, and I thought just fucking punted it completely. If the complaint, one of the complaints about the Empire Club speech was no empathy. Empathy is not, I give you permission to hate me. Like, I understand why you hate me is not, I feel your pain. It's a very different thing. And I just don't understand what that was all about. And I've come to the conclusion, I don't think she has the communication skills to navigate the government through this inflation crisis. I think Trudeau is going to have to be the person that establishes a connection between the government and the people. Scott?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, look, we're talking about policy. We're talking about process and how governments will often substitute process when they don't have a policy remedy. And, I don't think that people need to be reminded that cost of living and inflation are monsters that came out of a global closet and that no single individual government is responsible for having created them. But I do think that people want to know that all governments are concentrating on that monster, that now that it's out of the closet, they're trying to do what they can to fight it, to push it back in the closet, to shrink it, right? And that isn't necessarily, if you don't have policy and processes is unhelpful and maybe even detrimental to that case, then you at least have to have tone. You've at least got to get tone right. And the tone was terrible. It's okay for people to hate me. I mean, that alone says, that's angering, right? But it's like, I didn't fucking ask you for permission to be mad at you. I was angry with you.
I was angry with you before you gave me permission.
Right. So, right? I mean, it's just there's a psychology to the tone there that is like, if that's your instinct, then we got a real troubling problem because as the chief spokesperson on this, we expect your instincts to be better. We expect your tone to be improved. And I don't know what to do about it. I don't know if Trudeau has to take over the file. I don't know, but they have got to demonstrate that whether he's in Kigali or she's on Rosie Barton, that they not only understand what people are going through, but they are turning over every stone possible, and they have an integrated plan. And it's not the plan that they created to address other problems a year ago, but that they are doing things. And I just keep coming back to it. Eventually, it does manifest in policy. If they don't do something soon, they will be forced into making bad choices that could have inflationary impacts, and that's, or counter effects like, adding to inflation, like, we'll start, just sending out relief checks to people or something. I don't know where they'll end up, but they'll end up in a mad ass scramble when they find out their polling has them at 23%. And Poilievre
they're going to end up sending checks, Scott. They're going to end up sending checks out to people to cover the cost of gas. That's what they're going to do.
So
Right.
I think you take shape of that now and you say, well, then let's decide what the best possible relieving measure is. That Venn diagrams the things that we think are least damaging, most helpful, and are seen as, most relieving. And, because if you don't take control of that debate's going to take control of you. That's just the way this thing ends. It ends with you at 22% and shitting your pants and doing stupid and bad things.
Howard, your take on this?
I agree with all that. I agree with Scott 100% that Christian Freeland is not a natural communicator in this vein. There are audiences I think she's very effective for. There's things she can talk about very effectively. She's very good talking to journalists as one of their own. She's very good in small groups. I've been in small meetings with her. She's very good at listening and making you feel like you've been heard. Follow through is often a different issue. But speaking to the public on a complicated issue like this and on a bad news issue, you're right. She doesn't seem to have whatever that the tone is that reassures Canadians. I don't think a single person listening to that interview, both on the tone and the substance, came away with an ounce of reassurance that this government understands the problem, A, and B, knows what to do about it, and C, is prepared to do anything about it. It really, some of that is on the lack of policy. They really sent her out there to catch a pass over the middle with no pads. I mean, she's got no answers other than, well, we already put stuff in the budget a year ago.
Can I ask you though? Can I ask you, Howard? Yeah. Why do you think that they've chosen this time to introduce the phrase fiscal restraint into their vocabulary?
Yeah,
not heard of for 7 years, right? Yeah. Not heard of when they were introducing $100 billion growth plans in budgets and stuff like that were spreading money hither, thither, and yon all over the place. And now all of a sudden, people can't afford bologna and gas, and fiscal restraint's the issue.
Yeah. It's I heard her use that phrase twice. They must have dusted that off from 2010, 2011 somewhere and brought out fiscal restraint. One, I'm not sure that's the message people want to hear, even if it's the right economic message.
They don't care. People have 99 problems, and the deficit is not one of them. That's it. Yeah. They don't care.
And second, they've shown absolutely zero interest in actually demonstrating fiscal restraint. It's one thing to roll out the phrase, but she didn't say a single thing in that meeting that was evidence of a specific policy that would cut spending on anything. No, sure there was. What it was, I'm not going to do anything to help you because we've got to exercise fiscal restraint. That was the message. But even then, they're still running massive deficits. Exercising fiscal restraint is not, we're going to continue to run massive deficits, even after COVID's ended and stimulus policies that are no longer needed because the economy is actually booming. Our problem is inflation right now. Our problem is the massive accumulated deficits. And they're not even looking to cut the current deficit. So she can say fiscal restraint, but she's not actually acting fiscal restraint. And she's certainly not talking about the kind of fiscal restraint that might actually be necessary. And she's not talking about how they got here in the first place. And yes, it's a global phenomenon. Yes, every country overspent during the pandemic, but Canada's spent more than most and didn't get as much bang for the buck as most countries. And she hasn't owned any of that. I don't expect her to. But it leaves her a very, very rich target for the Conservatives, for Pierre Poilievre or whoever wants to come in and talk hard economics about how we got here. Scott, fiscal restraint would not have emerged into her language inadvertently or undeliberately. What are they doing?
I think they have I think in addition to everything else that we've talked about, I think if you add up the clues that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 public interventions on the part of Freeland, I think you see an audience problem. I think that if you look at who the Empire Club speech was directed to, spoke to directly, invoked, who did it invoke, right? It didn't really invoke people sort of trying to work their way through $40,000 a year jobs, right? It was talking to Bay Street. It was talking to economists. It was talking to that sort of policy layer of people and saying, I know that you are saying any spending on our part, any incremental spending could be could further inflame inflation. I get that message. Now we're over the deficit. Now we're over the pandemic. We're going to constrain spending. And she has an audience issue. And it came up again in Rosie Barton's speech. She's speaking to Canadians when she's on Rosie Barton, right? She's speaking, it's as mass media, it's one of the broadest pipes you could possibly hope to get. And so she's talking to Canadians, but she's telling Canadians, I have to balance, right? What you're literally almost saying, I have to balance the pain that you're going through and the anxiety you have about where it's going to and how it's going to end with the need to not spend any more, to deficit. So deficit has suddenly emerged as a defining policy parameter where it didn't exist before. And I think it's an audience issue. I think they've suddenly decided that they care what that sort of group of the folks that call into the finance department care about. And we cared a lot about those people for years, David. I'm not being dismissive. You do care about that. That's an important constituency and stakeholder group for you when you're at finance. But it's odd to me that they've chosen a moment where we have a general population policy/political crisis, and they are narrowcasting the priority that they are communicating. I think that's an odd audience mismatch they've got going. And as long as they continue to worry about what the chief economist at the Bank of Montreal thinks, the further offside they're going to get, the wronger their tone will continue to be with the broad public.
Cool. All right, let's bring this thing home with our hey yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The hey yous are about to begin.
Scott, you ready to start? Give Howard a chance to fucking pull himself together for his first ever hey you.
Yep. I don't think he needs to pull himself together. Yeah. I'm just going to stay beating on the same drum. My hey you is to Chrystia Freeland, right? Go back to Ottawa. Don't go back to University of Rosedale. Don't go back to Toronto. Right? Go back to Ottawa. Close the door. Go into that CMO room, right? That boardroom that sits adjacent to the finance minister's office. Call those people in and say, guys, everything we're doing right now, policy, politics, tone, it's all not working. So we are not leaving this goddamn room, right? And we will eat shitty catered food until we come out of here with a better approach, a better storyline, and a better tone. And she has to take on the tone, but she's got to demand, they have to build a better robot to go out there and fight these wars. Because right now they are not doing it right. And it's just there's no summer. There can be no summer. This thing has to start yesterday, and it needs a full back to code correction.
Could all be over by the end of barbecue season, right? Like, I mean, if it goes unchecked through it. Anyway.
Well, one more thing. There's an implicit assumption that these guys are also making. They don't articulate this. They're smart enough to not say this out loud. But there's an implicit assumption that a bunch of these measures are taking hold already. That that some of the relieving checks will actually start to kick in, childcare, that kind of stuff. That some of the forces that are channeling inflation, they are going to be saying to themselves quietly, you know what? This thing is already moving in our direction. So, like, let's not panic now, overcorrect, and do something that either makes it worse or that gets in the way of the improvements that's happening. And that is, maybe they'll be right, but I think that's a hell of an assumption, and I'm not convinced there is a policy basis to believe that.
All right.
Yeah, I would say that's a heck of a risk. Sorry to cut into the hey yous here. I hope for the sake of Canadians that's right, but I worry that that's just painfully delusional at this point.
All right, brother. Who are you calling out today?
Hey, you. I pulled myself together somewhat. My hey, you is honestly to Jenny Byrne, our friend, best campaign mastermind in the country, who's doing a bang up job on the Polyev campaign right now. My hey, you to Jenny is get that thing wrapped up and win it and come back onto the show so amateurs like myself don't have to expose our inadequacies to the country at 6:45 in the morning. Please come and relieve us. Take me out, Coach. I'm done. Thank you.
You were awesome. I want Jenny back too, but you've been awesome today. My hey you goes out to Amy Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, Samuel Alito. Fuck you.
God bless him. Good night.
Fuck you guys. All right. I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS. I'd like to thank our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank all you Hurley Burleyites for listening. Scott Reid, my buddy, for being here with me, and Howard Anglin for doing this today. It was great to talk to you and get to know you. Thanks for your time. And see everybody next week for more Curse of Politics. Take care of yourselves.
Can't wait to listen to someone else.
It was great, Howard. Thanks, man. Great to meet you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks, David. You guys are the best.